name is Igor Štiks, and I'm a professor at the Faculty of Media and Communications in Belgrade, also a professor at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ljubljana, and I also teach in a European Regional Master Program in Democracy and Human Rights in Sarajevo and Bologna, which is a part of a global campus. I often teach about citizenship, about equality and rights. Today I will try to show you how all of this is connected and why we should pay more attention to the questions of citizenship in our world in the 20th century, in a world that is transforming very quickly, and with it, our rights also are transforming. Some are expanding, but some being reduced. Now I'm going to show you how this struggle historically evolved and why this is important. You might, of course, ask yourself why we started with the question, why we say oppose so openly the question of order and social justice. Are they necessarily opposed? Are they in conflict? What is actually their relationship? Why we put order under quotes? Of course, it all comes to Martin Luther King and his famous quote from a letter he wrote from Birmingham jail in 1963. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion, writes Martin Luther King, that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. He wrote it, as I said, from a Birmingham jail. So he was put in jail simply because he decided to come to Birmingham in southern parts of the United States to support the struggle of African Americans against discrimination and segregation. Some then wrote that his actions were unwise and untimely. Revolted by these accusations, Martin Luther King wrote an open letter, basically claiming the following, another famous quote from his letter: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Obviously, Martin Luther King was speaking here about the American context, but the general global context. How do we respond to injustice? And obviously, in this case, in the 50s and the 60s, it was the racial segregation and the fight against discrimination. Now, the thing was that African Americans were American citizens. Being American citizen meant also obeying the laws, even when they were discriminatory, meant also paying taxes, and also meant going to war, like so many African American men did. But this did not entail that the rights were equal for everyone, for every citizen. And therefore, the long struggle for civil rights was unfolding after the Second World War. It was a very nasty and violent battle for the basic thing, that we are all treated equally as citizens.
So what Martin Luther King was trying to do, some other people also followed, some very important people, such as Judge Earl Warren, who in his famous dissenting opinion in 1958 wrote the following: "Citizenship is man's basic right, for it is nothing less than the right to have rights." Judge Earl Warren will be a very important person in order to actually legally change the status of African Americans. When he mentioned a right to have rights, actually he was quoting Hannah Arendt, German Jewish American philosopher who already in 1949 wrote about the right to have rights and tied this right directly to citizenship. She's been suspicious that any framework guaranteeing human rights could actually protect people. After the experience of Holocaust and after the experience of so many people who lost citizenship, she was convinced that that being outside the political community, being outside of a state that could guarantee your rights, you cannot count that your rights will be actually respected. Again, our story of the rights, the history of rights that we know as modern men and women, is tied to national citizenship, is tied to this evolution of modern citizenship that usually happen within the framework of nation state. But how actually these rights evolved? It's not that they've been given. It seems they were never given. In his lecture in 1949, on Citizenship and Social Class, T.H. Marshall gave us an approximate evolution of citizenship rights. That in the 18th century, there was a struggle for civic rights, an upcoming bourgeois class struggling against the inherited rights of aristocracy. In the 19th century was the struggle for political rights, namely expanding rights to working men, and not yet women. The women rights to vote, for instance, will only come in the 20th century. It will take another struggle to get there. Now, in his schematic approach to the question of evolution of citizenship rights, the evolution that was not the same everywhere, he pointed out something very important. This is the innovation the 20th century brought, or we should rather say mid of 20th century, which is in inclusion of social rights as part of citizenship rights. T.H. Marshall saw that there is a big problem. Our societies, especially in the West at that time, but also today, are capitalistic societies. Capitalism is about inequality. Citizenship should be about equality. So how do you reconcile the two? In his view, the changes that happened after the Second World War with the expansion of social rights, such as health, right to health insurance, right to education, right to social benefits, the state that could guarantee you minimum of social rights to preserve your dignity, they were for him the only way forward. That the gap brought by economic and socioeconomic inequality should be somehow bridged by expansion of social rights. Now, as you can see on this screen, this is a leaflet from the late 70s, a leaflet inviting people to struggle to preserve the National Health Service, the NHS. National Health Service that had been introduced after the Second World War, and that for the first time, so it happened really recently, allowed for a vast majority of British citizens to actually have a health coverage. As you know, in the United States, this is still an ongoing issue. At the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, with the new paradigm that the state should withdraw from managing social rights, from managing also the markets, with these ideas that the states should let to the markets decide about even social rights, the NHS was under threat, and it still is. As you can see here, activists were calling to fight against the cuts to these rights that were seen as guaranteed, but only for a brief period of time, for some 30 years. Now the question is, what really happened, and how we moved from redistribution provided by the welfare state towards recognition from social to cultural rights, and what is the ideology behind all these changes. Before we get to these changes that will, of course, determine also our world today, let me just step back and just try to discuss the question of political community. What is a political community? That is, of course, bounded by the ties of citizenship. Who is in and who is out? The oldest question. Obviously, we still don't have a global community, that global political community, so that everyone could be included. we are still fragmented in states. But what states could do today in our era? So that this discussion about political community was also about discussion between the relationship between individual and community. And this is the struggle between or the conflict or the polemics between liberals and communitarians. Liberals insisting on the rights-based approach. The only relationship between me and the state is determined by rights and how many rights the state gives to me. Of course, the state would say something different, and something that communitarians would also say, which is, it's not only about you. It's not only about your rights. It is also about duties. And it is also about common good. Political community is also about common good. What you can also contribute to this common good, so to have also your rights protected. Citizenship has been always seen as a slightly discriminating, even when it pretended to be equal. Obviously, in the case of the United States that you saw, it was an obvious discrimination. In some other cases, many other people would say, wait a minute, you cannot really claim that we are all equal when we don't have equal material position. Obviously, this was the Marxist critique of supposedly equal citizenship. Feminists would say, well, just look at the history. It's been male history. Women been struggling for so long to get their rights, even their political rights. And even when they got them, actually societies are still patriarchal. It is the man leading the show, and no quotas could actually fix this. Multiculturalists would say something different. Okay, this is all fine, but our societies are increasingly diverse and plural. And obviously, national citizenship that was based on a certain model, male, a certain fixed national identity, language, culture, history, and so on, does not correspond to the diversification of our societies and to the demands of minorities that's been historically neglected. So something has to be done. Now the question is, of course, how? The questions of multiculturalism still dominate our societies or dominate our societies for like 30 years. What does it mean to live in a multicultural societies? What are the demands of minority? Are they territorial? Are the demands of political autonomy? Are the demands for cultural autonomy? Are the demands for religious freedoms that might clash with certain democratic standards or with certain human rights standards? How to respond to all of this? We could see that in some places there is a drive towards more multicultural, pluralistic society, and many battles being won on this front. On the other hand, we can see also that there is a lot what we call a chauvinism or simple discrimination that is formal or informal, very often informal in spite of the laws. That we can see that there are parts of communities or that very often is a majority that see that their identity has been endangered by the influx of various minorities, refugees, migrants, and so on. They think that actually the wealth should not be shared with newcomers, with those that do not share national identity. And we are now in the midst, just take an example of France today, in the midst of this discussion. What is the identity that we should all have? And how actually to fit the real diversity within the framework that's been defined during the evolution of national state, last 200 years. The nation state is transforming radically, and not only at the level of identity. It is actually, it has been already transformed by what we would call neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as economic ideology of the free market, ideology that would say that we need free market, we need to open up the globe for a free market competition, and that the only way to achieve human freedom is through free market mechanisms, and that the state itself should distance from the social and economic processes. The state's been seen especially welfare state after the Second World War, as the biggest problem of human freedom. So the neoliberals thought that actually the mechanisms of free market might fix the situation or the crisis in which many states were in the 70s, and might actually respond to the demands for various be it cultural freedoms or sexual freedoms or simply freedom of choice. Now we live in the era in which we question the neoliberal principles, although they've been dominant for the last 40 years, and obviously they still are. This is the global wealth pyramid of 2020. Now, I will let you find your own place in this global pyramid. If you have in your assets, houses, cars, money, inheritance, more than $100,000, then you belong to the luckiest 10% or 11% of the human population. As you can see, 55% of humanity has 1.3% of the entire wealth, whereas 1% obviously has more than almost 45% or 46% of the entire wealth of the entire humanity. Now, how do you actually discuss the question of socioeconomic justice in this context? In the context of enormous inequalities. So many books been written about this issue, about how you actually gonna deal with the fact that the world changed to such enormous degree. Now, and how do we live in this interconnected world from all parts, in which states might not be the major engines, the major framework, say, for our political communities, that they've been in this respect surpassed, but at the same time, they actually decide on who is in, who is out. They discuss on the rights, and the politics is still mostly related to the national state as it is. Now, I want just to briefly to simply point out that cities could play enormous role in these struggles. We are urban species, as some would say. There will be 50% of us living, already 55%, and there will be 65% of us very soon living in urban areas. This, and very often in these enormous metropolitan areas. Cities are places of enormous wealth. Look at this wonderful bathroom, but also of places of enormous poverty. Look at the ruins of Detroit, for instance, or look at this photo from Latin America, where the inequality is so clearly marked. On one hand, 1%, and on the other hand, 90% of people that basically in many places live in slums. And there's already 20% of humanity living in slums without basic infrastructure. Or look at this picture from London, Grenfell Tower, and the disaster that happened there. And look in the distance what you see, big skyscrapers, and also a gentrified, completely gentrified environment. Now, this is why in the cities, we are going to see a lot of struggles. We're going to see a lot of struggles for our rights. Cities are becoming the major arenas where we protest, where we gather, where we actually want to have more say in this world where we think that basically there's nothing we could control. Cities are also places of enormous inequality. And as Brazilian geographer Milton Santos once said, the worth of every citizen depends on his location on the territory. And I would say it depends on your or my location in cities where we live. How close are we to infrastructure? How much time the commuting takes in basically every day? Can we access certain rights that are formally guaranteed to us in this context? And but again, as I said, cities are now trying to impose themselves as the new players in a global world and in new arenas where we fight for justice. Zuccotti Park or Gezi Park, fighting for our basic environment. This is Paris for 2016, fighting against the climate changes or potential extinction. Finally, fighting for racial justice by occupying certain parts of the city and establishing citizens' assemblies. Now, the question is, of course, how we as citizens of these cities will actually reconcile this with the fact that we are citizens of states, and that political mechanism, a political format within which we live, does not adequately responds to our demands and to the crisis we actually live right now. Now, I will conclude with the question of peace that we started discussing at the beginning. You might be familiar with the Kant's ideas of perpetual peace among peoples of the world, among states. He would say we need republican order, which could translate it into citizenship, equal citizenship. We need a federation of free states, and we need some sort of world citizenship based on hospitality. But it seems that this would, of course, allow us mostly negative peace as the absence of tension, which was Kant's aim. Hospitality might point out also to the question of justice. But the question is, of course, how are we going to achieve not only just negative peace, as we said, the absence of tension, but also positive peace as the presence of justice. And it seems that each generation of each political community will have to find an answer to this pressing question. We are the ones who will need, in our circumstances, in places where we live, to find the answer to the question how to assure the presence of justice. Thank you.